Welcome to the keynote presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I would like to thank our platinum level sponsors, the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law and Policy, and Miyoka's Creamery. This session will include a pre-recorded interview with Jonathan Safran Foer, followed by a live Q&A. With that, we'll jump right into the presentation. Thank you. Hello, my name is Pamela Hart, and I'm Executive Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies. And on behalf of the Center for Animal Law Studies and the Animal Legal Defense Fund, I am thrilled to announce our keynote speaker, Mr. Jonathan Safran Foer. Jonathan is the author of 3 award-winning and internationally best-selling novels, Everything is Illuminated, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, and Here I Am, as well as 2 works of nonfiction, Eating Animals and The New American Haggadah. He won the Guardian Book Prize for his debut novel, was included in Granta's Best of Young American Novelist issue, as well as the New Yorker's 20 Under 40 list of the best young writers in the US. And his books are published in over 30 languages. Here I Am was long listed for the International Dublin Literary Award for 2018. His most recent book, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast, was published by FSG in September 2019. And with that, why don't we start with our first question. Many of your earlier works are fiction. How different process-wise or approach is writing fiction compared to nonfiction works?
So process-wise, it was entirely different. In terms of my approach, it was exactly the same. So the reason it was different with process was because I was moving toward a goal. In the case of nonfiction with Eating Animals, I knew that I was writing about contemporary animal agriculture. And in the case of We Are the Weather, I knew that I was writing about the relationship between food and the climate, or maybe more broadly, the question of what we can do as individuals in this moment of climate crisis. So with nonfiction, I had to pursue fact. And in the cases of the 2 books nonfiction books that I've written, that was oftentimes quite difficult because facts were obscured in the case of Eating Animals by an extremely secretive industry, or facts were just complicated when writing about climate change, which is such an unbelievably broad and complex subject. But what my books have in common, fiction and nonfiction, which I sort of alluded to before, is that I write about things that bother me. You know, there's an old joke or saying that once upon a time, there was a person whose life was so good, there's no story to tell about it. Stories are born out of something being wrong. If you think about every novel you've ever read, they're always about a lack of peace and a movement, ideally, toward peace, or at least a struggle toward peace. So my relationship to food has been something that has bothered me for as long as I can remember. It may be like the oldest struggle in my life. I was 9 years old when I first became aware of the problems of eating animals. They were brought to my attention by a babysitter, actually. And I think when I was 9, I probably resolved what I thought, actually, what I felt and thought, which was an echo of what this babysitter told me, which is we shouldn't harm things unless we have to. We shouldn't harm living things unless it's absolutely necessary. But despite being persuaded by that, I found it challenging over the course of my life. As my life has developed, my ways of thinking have developed, the information that I have access to has changed. I found it hard to respond consistently to what it is that I've always known and felt. And it was that struggle, actually, that I wanted to write about, even more than the realities of contemporary American agriculture, animal agriculture, or the realities of climate change. I was really writing quite personally about something that was not at peace inside of me.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's stay there then and talk about Eating Animals if we can. In that book, you focus on the moral dimensions of our food choices, specifically as they relate to cruelties inflicted upon animals and factory farm conditions. And then in your new book, We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast, you scrutinize how factory farming is a significant contributor to climate change And you make the argument that we need to eat fewer animal products if we are going to address the biggest problem facing humanity today. What prompted you to look at factory farming from this new angle?
Well, first of all, let me just correct one thing that you said, which I often hear, which is you argue that we need to eat fewer animal products in order to save the planet. That's a kind of summary of what you said. It's not an argument that I'm making, and it's not an argument that anybody's making. It's science as we understand it. The IPCC, which is now the gold standard for climate science and which the UN relies upon, has said we have no hope of meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Accords unless we eat dramatically less meat and less dairy. So it's really, it might sound like it's a distinction without a difference, but I think it's really important to make clear this isn't anybody's opinion. This isn't anybody's argument. This is science as we understand it. So what motivated me to return to the subject of animal agriculture and this time look at it, look at the relationship to the environment? In fact, nothing motivated me to. I didn't want to. I was very proud that I wrote Eating Animals. It was a difficult book for me to write in a lot of different ways. It challenged me as a writer. Writing nonfiction doesn't come as naturally to me as writing fiction does. And it very much challenged me as a person to have to confront my own paradoxes and my own hypocrisies and the distance between who I want to be, or even how I think of myself and who I actually am. I thought that I was going to write a book about climate change and that it would have no element of food in it. As I said before, I tend to write about things that are unsettled inside of me. And I have felt over the past 5 years very unsettled when witnessing my own response to the climate crisis, which has largely been a non-response. I certainly say the right things and I have the right opinions in the sense that they're in keeping with science. And I attend marches and I have some cool t-shirts with, cool slogans and some cool bumper stickers. But if I were really to confront the realities of my lifestyle and my choices, which is hard to do because it can be very shaming, I have to acknowledge that not only do I do very little, but my carbon footprint is almost certainly greater than that of the average science denier, climate change denier. So I wanted to get to the bottom of what that means, what it means to me, and what it might mean to other people who are in a similar situation. I know an awful lot of people who are. So I set out to write about this question of what to do as an individual in the moment of climate crisis. And it became clear very, very quickly that I couldn't write an honest book on that subject without talking about food. We know that there are 4 things that individuals do that matter significantly more than everything else when it comes to the climate crisis. Flying, driving, having children, and eating animal products. So, and eating animal products is unique among those 4 things, both because of how unconstrained our choice is. 85% of Americans who drive to work. And most of us live in places that require automobiles. Not all of us, but most of us. The majority of airplane flights that are taken in the United States are for business or for what are called non-leisure personal purposes, like going to visit a sick relative. So it might be nice to say, let's just stop flying. It's not realistic and it's not really fair. And most people, and probably most people who are watching this now, are just not in the process of deciding at this exact moment whether or not to have a child. But everybody's going to eat a meal in the next couple of hours. Most of us eat many times a day, and we have this choice that we make many times a day, which is unconstrained. There are certainly people on the planet for whom it's not unconstrained, but in America, it is unconstrained. Harvard Medical School did a study at the end of 2018 and found that it's $750 a year cheaper to eat as a vegetarian than to eat as a meat eater. Meat eating is also, or I should say eating animal products, is also the only one of those 4 acts that I just mentioned that immediately addresses methane and nitrous oxide, which are 2 of the most powerful greenhouse gases. So we can't have an honest conversation about what we're going to do as individuals in this moment without talking about food. So I found myself back sort of in the territory of eating animals, if approaching it from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in We Are the Weather, you suggest that people could consider limiting their consumption of animal products to the last meal of the day or some similar type of compromise. How does this call to eat fewer animal products compare to the call to stop eating animals altogether in light of the cruelty that we see on factory farms?
Well, so there's a lot of it's a lot to untangle. You know, there's the question of um, refraining from eating animal products altogether. There's the question of refraining from eating any animal products from factory farms. Um, there's the question of maintaining an identity, and then there's the question of outcomes. If you were to ask me, yeah, okay, so first of all, we should take as a starting point that these are universal human values that we're talking about. These are not Democrat or Republican values. They're not religious or secular, old or young. The desire to cause less violence and less suffering, and the desire to cause less destruction, these are universal human values. 96% of Americans think that animals deserve legal protection from cruelty. If you can think of anything else that many Americans agree on, I would love to hear about it. So the question is, how do we achieve those goals that we all share? You know, will it be through a changing of identities? Will it be through a changing of habits? Will it be incremental, or will it happen in leaps? And I don't know. If you were to ask me, what are the odds that half of Americans will be vegetarian in 5 years? My guess is 0. If you were to ask me, what are the odds that half of the meals eaten in America will be vegetarian in 5 years? I think there's a very real chance of that. I think a lot of there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful about that. So those would result in the same outcome in terms of the amount of violence and destruction that is reduced. I suppose that I've made sort of 2 wagers in my life. One is very personal, and one has to do with the society that I live in. Personally, I want to have as little to do with factory farming as possible. And because factory farms produce more than 99.9% of the animals that we eat in America, if you want to move away from factory farms, you really have to move away from animal products. That's a very personal choice. When I think about the society that we are all participating in the ongoing creation of, I want to reduce the amount of suffering and destruction as quickly as possible and as broadly as possible. I know many, many, many people, personally, and because I've now been, having conversations like this in front of audiences for a decade or 15 years, all over America and all over the world. There are many people, and we can choose to sympathize with them and understand them, or we can choose not to. Many people who want to be involved and are not going to be involved completely. Many people who agree that factory farming is miserable, who agree that animals deserve protection, who agree that the environment is in need of protection, but are not going to become vegetarians anytime soon or ever, but could easily imagine and can actually enthusiastically imagine reducing the amount of animal products that they consume. So what do we do with that? I know that there are people, maybe you're one, I have no idea, who would say, well, that's like, if something is bad in an absolute way, we don't want to condone it at all. I have nothing but respect for absolutists like that. There's another approach, which is my approach, which is how do we persuade as many people as possible to take the largest steps possible for them. And that's why, with both eating animals and with We Are the Weather, I take a strategy that's more incremental. And that disappoints a certain kind of reader. And I'm glad that it does. And I'm glad that those people exist. And I think that they have an equally important role to play in pushing this conversation forward. But I feel like this is my role to play.
I'd like to move on to We Are the Weather and stay there. And in that book, you talk about structural change, and things need to change at that level in order to address the global crisis. What structural changes do you believe need to take place in order for us to confront this complex issue of climate change?
We need to dismantle the factory farm system. We need to get rid of them and to live in a country like the one we lived in 75 years ago, 50 years ago. And it's so heartening to see that conversation now in Congress. You know, Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren co-sponsored a bill to effectively dismantle the factory farm system. A very quick way to do it would be to stop subsidizing their destruction, both in the form of corn and soy subsidies, but also not holding them responsible for the destruction that they are perpetrating. Smithfield, one of the largest, if not the meat packers in the country, meat producers in the country, in 1 year had more than 8,000 violations of the Clean Water Act. So if they'd had 5, we would say it happens when you're a company of that scale. If they'd had 50, we would say somebody needs to keep a better eye on this company. If they'd had 500, we would say that's really reckless. 8,000 is a business model. That's not destruction that's happening by accident. That's destruction that's happening on purpose. And it's happening on purpose because it's obviously advantageous to their bottom line, because they're externalizing costs that they should be paying, costs of environmental cleanup. If those costs were not externalized, if we simply held these farming corporations responsible, if we enforced the laws that are already on the books, then the $2 hamburger at McDonald's would be $20. It would be, you know, there are a lot of people who are resistant to the idea of regulating markets in the interest of environmental protection. We are regulating markets only in the interest of environmental destruction right now. If we allowed simply as a starting point for the free market solution of having things cost what they actually cost, people would eat meat far, far, far less, because the actual cost of meat is exorbitant.
And so what counter arguments have you heard in the way of industrial animal agriculture representing a solution to the climate problem? We've talked about a lot of the ways it would collapse if we took away these subsidies. But for example, I know that the industry has pointed to methane capture as an energy source, along with other technological advances. Do you find any of these positions or arguments convincing?
No, I mean, it's like putting a silencer on a gun. The first of all, none of it is realistic. It's not happening in anything like the near term. In the near term, more and more people are eating more and more animal products, and the practices, the most destructive practices, which we developed in America, are now spreading across Asia. Europe is a done deal already, and the American diet, even maybe more frightening, is moving into India and China. If India and China fully adopt the American diet, and everything else holds constant, even if there's not another person born, we're going to have twice as many animals factory farmed every year. The answer is obvious. It's not to try to retrofit a cow. It's to eat fewer cows. And I have yet to meet a climate scientist, and I've yet to meet a farmer. I don't mean a CEO of a farm corporation or a spokesperson for a farm corporation. I mean the kind of farmer most of us imagine when we imagine farmers, and there are very few of them left. There are fewer farmers today. I don't mean per capita as a real number. There are fewer farmers today in America than there were during the Civil War, despite the fact that our population has doubled 11 times. The farmers that there are despise factory farming and acknowledge what, again, is nobody's argument or perspective, but is the truth, which is we just have to eat far fewer of these kinds of foods. The earth is a finite size. The human population keeps growing. meat is, among the many, many ways that it's destructive, it's an incredibly inefficient food. It takes between 6 and 26 calories put into an animal to get 1 calorie back. We live in a world in which, there are hundreds of millions of starving children, and it is a problem with a cure, at least for now. So, in a way, it boils down to what is our desperation to solve, to find ways to try to eat the amounts of meat that we're eating now that we never ate historically. The most comprehensive analysis of the relationship between animal agriculture and the environment was published in Nature magazine about a year ago. And the scientists studied food systems all over the planet and found that indeed there are places where people simply don't have access to enough calories or other kinds of food. And in those rare places, they can eat a little bit more meat and a little bit more dairy. But we don't live in those places. In Europe, in the UK, and the United States, scientists not argued, but stated that we need to reduce our meat consumption by about 90% and our dairy consumption by about 60% in order to avoid what they called irreversible climate collapse. We have to take that as the starting point. We don't all have to take the same path to that conclusion, and we will arrive at that conclusion by our own processes and in our own time, which is to say some people learn about the effects of animal agriculture on the environment and become vegan immediately after hearing it. Other people, for other people, it's a process that takes years and maybe decades. I don't think this is going to be easy for anybody, but it's going to be infinitely easier than if we don't take these steps now, and if the changes are not ones that we make with intention, but are ones that are forced upon us.
Thank you. If we could pivot a bit on a separate but related topic. You wrote your book before the coronavirus outbreak. How do you see the argument against eating animals impacted by this current pandemic?
Well, one of the happy side effects of this incredibly tragic period is that it has forced a lot of us to question, forced everybody to question what is essential. Even that word essential worker, that expression, which I don't remember having used before. It's interesting. Why is an Amazon delivery person essential? Why is somebody delivering from a Chinese restaurant essential when a school teacher is not essential? Nobody is forcing them to go back to work. What kinds of foods are essential? Why did Trump deem meat so essential that he forced workers at meat plants who didn't want to work? He forced them to work. They didn't want to work because it's already the most unsafe profession in the country. And during the pandemic, the largest meat plants became the largest hotspots for corona. So it's compelled us to ask what's essential. It's also reminded us of our ability to change. Who would have thought that cities and states and countries could close down within a matter of a week or two? Who would have thought that there was a world in which everybody, or not everybody, but an awful lot of people would wear masks, every time they left their homes, that people would quarantine. Our response does hold the promise, or rather it suggests our ability to make very big changes very quickly. But it's maybe not quite that simple, because I think a lot of those changes were made out of personal fear. If we were told that we had to shut down our economy, otherwise people in Bangladesh would get coronavirus, I don't know that we would. If we were told we had to wash our hands, otherwise people in Bangladesh would get coronavirus, I'm not sure that we would. A lot of the response has been self-serving, which is just, it's not a judgment, but it's the way humans are. And to solve the climate crisis, it will require a leap of empathy, because people in Bangladesh already are dying because of climate change. And similarly, animal welfare requires a leap of empathy, because the violence that's happening is out of sight. And of course, there's a species gap that most people feel a need to somehow traverse in order to care about animals. Most people need to imagine that animals feel pain in a way that we feel pain in order to care about their pain. I do have a basic kind of decency that I think is not special to me, that I think is shared by every person I've ever met, regardless of where they come from or what their political leanings are. And it comes back to that thing that my babysitter told me when I was 9, which is, it's not good to harm living things unless it's absolutely necessary. I find it hard to imagine the person who would disagree with that statement. It's not always easy to connect that to animal farming because it's distant, because the industry has gone to such great lengths to make sure not only that we don't see the reality, but that we see a lie. That these images of old-fashioned farmers who barely exist anymore are perpetuated in our minds. If you ever look at a package of meat, you will never, ever, ever see a windowless shed. If there's any image, it will be of a grain silo or animal on pasture. So we have to make connections that are concealed from us. And the bad news is that's very difficult to do. The good news is I really believe fervently that people want to make those connections. I believe fervently that people want to treat both animals and the planet with respect and care.
So with that all said, and your discussion and talking about the leap of faith, the question is, how do we get there? How do we implement and affect that change? Even with everything that's going on with the pandemic, including the effects it's had on slaughterhouse workers, less than 50% of Americans say that they're working to reduce their consumption of animal products. How do we shift that number?
Well, the other way of looking at that number, which is, it is about half of Americans are their consumption of animal products, which is an incredible statement if you pause and think about it. About half of Americans in blue states and red states, in Berkeley and in Dallas. Obviously not evenly, but spread out over the country. Half of Americans want to reduce their consumption of animal products. And the number is like parabolic with age. So the younger you get, the more interested people are in reducing their consumption of animal products. When I was in college, there were many more vegetarians than would admit to it because it was a kind of odd identity. It was at the fringe. Now more people admit to it than actually are because it's become an aspirational identity. There are more self-described vegetarians on American college campuses than Catholics. The arrow is absolutely pointed in the right direction, and it's obvious to anybody who bothers to look. You don't have to, track food purchases to know this, although you could and have it verified. If you lift your eyes up and look at the world around you, what's going on in pop culture? How many actors and musicians are vegetarian? If you go to a college campus, and it used to be that you could gauge interest in vegetarianism, or maybe it's better put as like an interest in moving away from meat by whether or not there were like PETA protesters with the Meat is Murder poster on campus. Now that's a relatively small part of animal activism on campuses. I think that kind of activism has a really important role to play, and I think we couldn't have reached this moment without that, but it's become more nuanced, for better and for worse. My hope and my belief is that even still in a dining hall of an American college, there will be several things to eat and then a vegetarian option. Probably now there's 2 vegetarian options in most dining halls. I think we're moving on tracks and with great speed toward a future where there are several things to eat and there's a meat option. I don't think meat is going to be illegal. I don't think it's going to be something that is thought of, or not anytime in the near future, thought of as, a crime. But I do think the norm is going to flip. And I think it will happen in restaurants as well, that the expectation and the desire is to eat as a vegetarian. And some people will choose to eat meat sometimes, but it will not be the expectation for a meal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's talk about a recent op-ed that you wrote in the New York Times, and it was called "The End of Meat is Here." And you argued that if you care about the working poor, about racial justice, about climate change, you have to stop eating animals. Can you talk specifically about the intersectionality between racial justice and industrial animal agriculture?
Well, yeah, a good place to begin is to note that people of color describe themselves as vegetarian at a higher rate than white people do. And as I said before, Harvard Medical School found that it's $750 a year less expensive to eat as a vegetarian. And we know that the effects on one's health and on the healthcare system are the more meat you eat, the more destructive the effects are. And I mention all of that in an effort to dismantle one of the most heard objections to any kind of suggestion that we should eat less meat, which is that it's elitist. And it's exactly the opposite. Factory farming, which brought with it not only new methods of food production, but new expectations for what meals are. When 1 out of 3 meals in America is eaten in an automobile, that is something that was brought to us by the factory farm industry. And it's something that punishes lower income people without access to food alternatives, people who live in food deserts, much more than it punishes white people. And it's not right to describe these things as eating choices when nutritional information is dishonest, when the only access some people have to food outside of the home is fast food. Not to mention that the industry, which famously exploits its workers, those workers are disproportionately people of color. And any way you look at it, it's something that is destructive for animals, for our bodies, and for the environment, but it's not equally destructive. There are some animals, like egg-laying hens, that get it worse than all other kinds of animals. And there are certain groups of people who suffer the effects of factory farming more than other groups. And those are people who live in inner cities and disproportionately people of color.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So as we talk about transitioning away from these meat-centered diets, and you brought up farmers earlier in our conversation, what role, if any, do you see farmers having in this transition?
Well, farmers will be at the very center of it and will need our help. So as I said before, there are fewer farmers than we've ever had. I mean, that is the goal of the factory farm industry, is to automate, to remove nature and to remove humans, and to automate a system that optimizes efficiency at the expense of animal welfare and at the expense of environmental sustainability. When I wrote Eating Animals, my expectation was that animal welfare groups would be the strongest supporters and farmers would despise it. As it turned out, I was almost exactly wrong. Animal welfare groups often found that the book didn't go far enough. And farmers really actually championed the book because there's nobody, with the exception of animals, there's nobody for whom factory farming is worse than farmers. So the animal farmers that exist, we will have to help them transition to producing other kinds of food. It's not as if farmers are going to go out of business. We're not talking about a future in which we eat less. We're talking about a future in which we eat differently. And the money that's now spent to prop up this dying industry should instead be spent to help the real farmers that still exist have proper livelihoods, that are safe, where they're not in a perpetual cycle of debt, when they are not forced to have practices that are anathema to why they became farmers in the first place. And to my knowledge, people don't become farmers because they want to mistreat animals. And people don't become farmers because they want to destroy the planet or because they want to breed pandemic viruses. And yet that's the position that farmers are now put in America. So we will need to help them with money.
And staying on the topic of eating animals and farmers, your book, Eating Animals, inspired a 2017 documentary by the same name. Do you think that documentaries have an important role to play in inspiring lasting change?
I think everything has an important role to play in inspiring lasting change. These problems are so broad, so complex, and people are so different from one another. When I go to the bookstore, there's not one novel. There are hundreds and hundreds of novels. And part of the reason for that is not every novel works for every reader. Some stories reach you that might not really reach me, and other stories might reach me that don't really reach you. So with a problem that is as profound and urgent and complex as animal agriculture, we need many, many different kinds of stories and storytellers. Some of them will be in culture, books or songs or movies. Some of them will come from the mouths of leaders like a Cory Booker or Elizabeth Warren or like a Greta Thunberg. And most of them will happen at dinner tables. They'll happen between friends. They'll happen between family members. And we need all of them. So I was so grateful that Christopher Quinn was the director of that film. I was so grateful that he made it, and I know that it will reach people. Some people who weren't reached by the book and who aren't reached by the other versions of the story that are being told. But we need more movies and more documentaries and more books and more public figures speaking out. And again, most importantly, we need these conversations replicated as often as possible between friends and family members.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And speaking of the various platforms there are that we can have these conversations, and sometimes difficult conversations, the New York Times swapped out an image in your May 21st op-ed from a graphic image of animal carcasses to more of an abstract illustration. What do you see as the role that imagery plays as we're talking about this subject?
Different images, just like different stories, reach us in different ways. And I have to admit that when I saw the photograph, which was the back of a truck that was filled with the carcasses of animals, my first thought was, I regret that they chose that. It is the truth, and it's the truth that we have to look at. It's also a truth that most people are not going to look at. So we can feel perhaps self-righteously or perhaps just authentically that, look, it's the truth, it's the truth, it's the truth. You have to look, you have to look, you have to look. But where does that leave us if it's not the most effective message? I am interested in the most effective message. Why? Because the problem is so urgent and the stakes are so high. 50 billion animals are killed in factory farms every year. Would I rather have the right message and or a softened, the most truthful message or a softened message that reduces the amount of suffering. I'd rather have the softened message. It's also the case that there isn't one true message, because there's not just one thing that we're referring to. Of course, like the image of carcasses on a truck is unassailably true, but there's also the truth of human psychology, the truth of how difficult it is for so many people, for most people, to approach this very scary issue. To most people, you have obviously spent a huge amount of time thinking about these things, as I have. Most people haven't. Most people still feel very, very threatened by conversations about meat. They feel that they are going to be grossed out. They feel that they're going to be scared. They feel that they're going to have a finger wagged at them, that they're going to be left feeling hypocritical or ashamed, or that someone's telling them that they're bad people. Certain kinds of images and stories reinforce those fears. There's another kind of image and story that says, hey, I care about these things just like you do. I don't even care about them more than you do. I've just spent more time caring about them. And so I have my own ways of engaging and looking and talking. And I'm not perfect and you're not perfect. There's got to be some way that we can talk about our hopes and fears and our shared values that's productive and doesn't leave us. There's an awful lot of people who would pick up that newspaper, look at it and say, not for me, not today. And that is a tragedy, when somebody is given a reason to look away, even if it's the truth, even if it's a necessary truth. To me, the most important and most necessary truth is we have to do this less. And whatever gets us to that place is what I'm interested in.
So we've talked a lot today about We Are the Weather and eating animals and the impacts of meat consumption. What have you observed makes people the most receptive to this topic? We talked right now about what makes them maybe not as receptive as we would hope, but what have you found works, and what makes you hopeful that people will actually take action?
So, there's the private sphere and the public sphere. In the private sphere, I have found that simply living one's life and making one's own choices is the most effective way to inspire other people to think about their choices. I have not had a lot of success in the private sphere, in the personal sphere, of arguing about this, or even of trying to persuade somebody. I told you I became a vegetarian because of this babysitter I once had. And she didn't actually try to persuade me of anything. She only spoke about it because we were sitting there and my older brother and I were eating fried chicken and she was with us. And I said, why aren't you eating it? And she said, oh, here's why. And she told me. If she had said, how can you guys eat that? Don't you know what that is? Maybe it would have persuaded me for a day or two, but I don't think that would have been a successful way to encourage me, to set me off actually on a lifetime of thinking about these things and caring about them. We live in a world where our choices have never been more closely monitored than they are now. And that's bad in almost every single way, but in this way it might actually be good. If you choose not to eat meat or not to eat an animal product, that choice is known. It's observed, it's recorded. Google for sure knows if you're a vegetarian. Apple knows if you're a vegetarian. Amazon knows if you're a vegetarian. Facebook knows if you're a vegetarian. And all of that knowledge, the accumulation of these individual choices, is not only shaping the culture, but shaping industry as well. It's Beyond Meat had one of the most successful IPOs in the last decade of the American stock market because of individual choices, not because of government regulation and not because of the beneficence of their CEO, as good a guy as he is, but because of individual preferences and choices. In the public sphere, I think there is an opportunity to do more than just make a choice, but to share something about why one choice might be better than another choice, which is, what I did with both of my nonfiction books. And I tried to, though, do it in both cases, not by making the reader the subject, and certainly not by sharing some kind of enlightenment that I've achieved. Instead, I wanted to share a struggle that I've been having and to make clear the difference between knowing what's right and being able to do what's right. I think most everybody knows what's right. However difficult it is to approach that truth, we know what's right. We certainly know what's wrong. We know it's wrong to keep a pregnant animal in a cage so small she can't turn around. We know it's wrong for animals to experience their own slaughter over the course of minutes. We know it's wrong to destroy the environment when there's so many other ways of producing food. So the question is, how do we take that knowledge that we share and turn it into behaviors that we share, choices, daily choices that we share? And that's really, really tricky business. It's a shame it's not as easy as knowing what's right, but it's clearly not. So we have to have a language for talking about these things that begins with generosity and that begins with humility, rather than a kind of certainty or rectitude about who's good and who's bad and what's right and what's wrong. But that begins with like an acknowledgement of how messy and confusing and often painful it is to be a human being and to wrestle with all of our sometimes overlapping, sometimes distinct identities, and all of our overlapping and sometimes distinct values. I think a good starting point is to say, I find this really tricky. Like, can we talk about it? Rather than you should find it really clear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's a really fantastic answer. And as we talked about off camera, I really enjoyed your book, We Are the Weather. I just finished it, and you managed to take a complex issue like climate change and make it really relatable and accessible and hopefully achievable. So I thank you for that. I also thank you for spending time with us today and having this conversation with me. At this point, we would like to go ahead and turn it over to the Q&A session with our audience. So thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, hello.
Great conversation again. That was a pleasure for me to be able to sit down and watch it, the whole content. So thank you. And not surprisingly, we have quite a few questions for you. We're limited on time, so I will just jump right in. So our first question is, one of the arguments I frequently hear in support of factory farming is that if we move away from this model, we would not be able to effectively and economically feed the planet. More specifically, do you have a recommended model that would replace industrial agriculture?
Well, I have heard different variations of that question myself many, many, many times. And it's a question that I think the factory farm industry has put into our minds that is informed by the notion that the industry is feeding the world in a way that we hadn't fed the world in the past or weren't able to and wouldn't be able to feed the world now. And it's just not true. It's not true at all. We are feeding the world unprecedented amounts of meat. That's true. There are also an unprecedented number of hungry and starving people in the world. There are, if you were to take the entire human populations of England and France, there are that many children under the age of 5 who are physically stunted because of malnutrition. So it's certainly not the case that we have solved the problem of hunger. As I said in our conversation before, meat is an incredibly inefficient way to produce food. It just requires huge amounts of energy and numbers of calories in to get very few calories out. which some people have equated with throwing the food that goes into an animal effectively away. So if it takes between 6 and 26 calories put into an animal to get 1 calorie out, one could say you're throwing away between 6 and 26 meals every time you eat meat. It's not quite that simple, but I think the spirit behind that statistic is true. The model, the futuristic model that we need, is actually a model from our past, which is when whatever animal farming there was done on small family farms, where animals were treated like animals rather than like machines, and where the earth was left in a better rather than worse place after the farming. But more importantly than that, we have to eat as previous generations ate, which is our expectation of a meal simply can't be that 2/3 of a plate are going to be covered in some sort of animal protein. To whatever extent people want to continue to eat animal products, they have to be used as a garnish rather than as the feature, which, by the way, is the case even now in most cuisines around the world. A lot of vegetarians and vegans, when they first travel, to the Middle East or to Italy or to Asia, suddenly find it so much easier to eat because in those cultures, meat is not featured in the same way that it is in our culture. So, but the bottom line is that whatever the techniques for farming, every specialist on global hunger, every specialist on climate sciences, and every farmer, crucially, that I've ever spoken to, agrees that we need to eat less meat. It is just unsustainable. It's unsustainable in the environmental sense, and it's also unsustainable ethically.
And I'll go to this next question, which I think ties in to a little bit of the segment of our conversation about eating animals, which I really found your perspective and your experience interesting, the farmers versus the animal protection people. And let's see here. Here's the question. Is there anything you decided not to include in We Are the Weather, Eating Animals, that you wish in hindsight that you had included? And if so, what would it be? Or what was it?
I love that question. I wonder if the person is asking that question because they sensed that there was something that I wasn't including. So nothing specifically comes to mind, but what I can say is that as I worked on both of those books, and maybe Eating Animals even a little bit more, but in each book in its own way, I really wrestled with two things. One, the usefulness of the book. My goal was not to write a philosophical treatise, and my goal was not to present an airtight argument. My goal was to present information, whether it was scientific information or psychological information, in a way that would motivate people who want to change their lives, but have had a hard time changing their lives. And there are a lot of different ways to tell the same story. I don't only mean the form of the story, like journalism or science or memoir or fiction, but one can tell a story in a strident way, or one can tell a story in a humble way, or in a conversational way, or in an argumentative way, in a stylish way, or in a very plain way. And throughout the process of writing these books, that was far and away the most difficult thing. And there were other extreme difficulties that I faced, like getting information about factory farms, and certainly getting any kind of physical access to factory farms. It required, going in the middle of the night. But even more difficult than that was striking a tone that would be useful. And so that involved me thinking about other people. The other thing that was quite difficult was thinking about myself and how my own beliefs, and this probably I did convey to some extent on purpose and to some extent by accident, my own beliefs are uncertain. I I know that factory farming is wrong. And I know that we need to dismantle that industry. When we live in a country where 99.9% of the animals that we eat come from factory farms, that begins to look an awful lot like moving away from meat altogether. Despite having written 2 books largely about animal agriculture, I don't know what I think exactly, or rather, I think different things at different times about the sort of philosophy of meat eating. I went to farms, and I was frankly surprised by my own reaction. I went to farms when I was writing Eating Animals, where I just couldn't deny that the animals were treated well. I couldn't deny that they were allowed to engage in their species-specific behaviors. I couldn't deny, having witnessed their slaughter, that they seemed not to anticipate it or experience it. And so there was a part of me that thought, I'm not sure to what extent this is wrong. There's another part of me, which I have to say is the dominant part of me, that perhaps in a way that's oversimplified, or perhaps in a way that's just honest, thinks this is wrong, 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 wrong. And any efforts to contextualize it, and any efforts to make room for people to, either in my own life or in the lives of others, to partake in any way in this system, is absolutely wrong. And, I try hard, as I'm sure you do too, not to see the world in binaries, but I also try hard not to have a kind of moral relativism that allows one to excuse things that are plainly wrong. So when I wrote Eating Animals, I wrote it without having resolved some of these questions. And, I wish I could present myself as somebody who has firmly resolved these questions for himself, at least, because that you sound like a more cogent and, strong person. But the truth is, I still do sometimes wrestle with this, particularly when, as a public person who is speaking about these issues with the hope of persuading other people to move away from meat. And I have an awareness that a measured approach is, I know from experience, vastly more successful than a strident approach. Sometimes that feels really good, and sometimes it feels really bad. It feels really good if I speak to an audience of 500 people and I know that several hundred of them are going to eat differently in response to the time that we had together. It feels bad if I go home and think to myself, I'm not sure I said the whole truth.
I appreciate that. And there's been a lot of really positive comments versus questions that I'll wrap up with, but about how much you've affected people's lives and how they're ordering your books right now as we speak, which leads me to another question about what is next for you. Have you started to work on your next book or project? Can we anticipate that it'll be related to animals or not? Are you willing to share any of that with us?
So I never would have thought that I was going to write We Are the Weather, and I certainly never thought that I would return to the subject of animal agriculture, because I felt proud of eating animals, and I felt like I explored what I was going to explore, and I said what I was going to say. I really just wanted to write a book about climate change, but it was impossible for me to do that without having it be largely about our eating choices. So I find it, again, hard to imagine that I will return to this issue. But I also find it hard, I actually find it impossible to imagine that it won't be an issue, that I will ever not have it be an alive issue for me, and that I will ever feel fully resolved about it. I assume that eating my values will be a struggle for me for the rest of my life. So normally we think of a struggle as a bad thing. I don't mean it that way at all. That struggle, it may be the thing in my life that I'm actually most proud of, because it has forced me to go pretty deep into myself and questioning what I believe, what I find sacred, what I find trivial, to wrestle, or at least to organize the different identities inside of me, inside of myself. So if that continues to be a struggle inside of me for the rest of my life, I can't imagine a way that it won't continually show up in my writing. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that I will ever again write a nonfiction book about the subject of eating animals, but I'm working on a novel right now, and I think if one were to, when I look at it, I can see how this struggle has found its way into that. I actually just started to write a screenplay for an animated movie for kids, and lo and behold, the subject has come up in that as well. That says something about me, but I think it also says something about the place of this conversation in the culture. What used to be at the margin and addressed only when you would encounter an animal rights activist is now right at the center of our cultural thought, and thought of alongside all of these other social justice issues that we're finally talking about, and that are finally, not only in our hearts, but coming out of our mouths.
Well, I think that is a perfect way to close. I see that we have run out of time. I wish I could read everyone's questions and share everyone's comments. I'll work with the support team to see if there's a way we can publish those, because there's some really great, fantastic comments. But thank you, Jonathan. I've really enjoyed our conversation and our time with you, and we so appreciate you being our keynote for this year's Animal Law Conference. I have a few housekeeping items. If you would like to connect with myself or with Jonathan after this panel, visit the networking page to find our virtual business cards and send a chat message. You can also chat this way with your fellow attendees. A recording of this presentation will be available on the virtual event platform tomorrow. To view the recording, just go to the agenda page, find that session, and click Watch Now. And this concludes the panel for Saturday. And I hope to see you all again tomorrow online for the final day of this year's Animal Law Conference. And with that, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.